You are 12 years old. Your hands are folded in front of you, calloused but trembling. You do not know the man's name, only that he smells of clove oil and brandy. He wears a coat brighter than the saffron robes of your village priest. His boots crush the garden gravel behind you as he walks in circles, observing, measuring. You are standing in the courtyard of the Dutch governor's house in Colombo, barefoot on hot stone. The woman who brought you here, the one who calls herself your aunt but is not told you to be still, that smiling will help, that the white men like it when you smile. You try, but the moment he reaches out to touch your chin, something freezes inside you. Not from fear, not yet. From confusion. This is not work. This is not the spice fields. Not the cattle. Not the temple. This is something else. His fingers lift your chin. Your teeth clench. He smiles. You have been chosen. You will not go home. You will live in the house of the company now, dressed in white silk, not rags. You will carry a tray and light candles. You will serve wine to Dutch officers who spit Tamil like it is sour milk. You will bathe in the garden and sleep in a small room, alone, unless he calls you, unless he comes to your room at night, unless he asks you to kneel. No one will warn you. No one will stop it, because this is not slavery. This is service. And you, child, are the offering. But before we continue, if you appreciate long-form, quiet history that remembers the forgotten, please consider subscribing and comment where you're watching from. It helps us keep making these videos. Now, back to the story. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch East India Company, known as the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, had become more than a commercial enterprise. It was an empire with a flag, an army, and its own legal code. From Amsterdam to Batavia, from Cape Town to Colombo, the VOC enforced its will, not only through trade, but through transformation. Territory became property. People became inventory. Culture became disorder, something to be corrected. Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, had long been coveted by European powers. For one reason, cinnamon, the spice, once more valuable than gold, grew along the island's western coast. The Portuguese had seized it first, establishing forts and missionary posts. But in 1656, the Dutch arrived with sharper muskets and colder intentions. They took the coast by force, drove out the Jesuits, and declared the land a protectorate of profit. Unlike the Portuguese, the Dutch did not seek to baptize every soul. They sought to classify them. Native rulers were demoted to diplomatic instruments. Buddhist temples were surveyed and taxed. Villages were reorganized into districts with registers, quotas, and obligations. In Dutch minds, this was not occupation. It was order. But control required more than soldiers. It required eyes, ears, hands that could move through native spaces and report back. The Dutch needed intermediaries, not adult men, who might rebel, but boys, quiet boys, beautiful boys, boys who could be taught to speak the language of command and to endure without question. Thus began a policy never written in laws, but inscribed in practice. Families impoverished by war or famine, or punished through withheld grain taxes, were offered a way out. Offer your son, the company would say, and he will be educated, housed, fed, protected. He will serve a good Christian household. He will become part of civilization. Some parents believed it. Others had no choice. A bag of rice, a promise of leniency, a look the other way. These were the terms of the exchange. Most of the boys were between 8 and 14. They were given starched white garments and renamed in Dutch fashion. Some were housed in boarding compounds called Nektenhuizen, houses of boys in service. Others, more promising, were placed directly in the homes of colonial officials, where they were called huisbedienden, or house servants. The word was gentle. The reality was not. Servicement silence. Servicement discipline. Service meant obedience so complete that even the smallest act of resistance, a dropped cup, a turned gaze, a trembling lip could bring the whip or expulsion, and for a boy expelled, there was no home left to return to. He had already been unmade. These boys were not legally enslaved. The VOC, unlike the Portuguese, had specific rules about freeborn natives, but in practice, the difference was one of paperwork They could not leave. They could not refuse. They were not paid. They were not safe. Reports from the time mention the exceptional loyalty of certain servant boys. Others note how eagerly some boys mimicked the manners of their Dutch masters. But buried beneath those descriptions is something more sinister. Observers commented on how the boys were pretty, delicate, or refined. They were compared to court pages in Europe, trained to flatter, to decorate, to entertain. The position of a boy servant was ornamental, intimate, and frequently abused. In Dutch letters and court records, there is an eerie absence of complaint. Not because abuse did not happen, but because it was not considered wrong. A boy was expected to adore his master, to feel gratitude, to remain silent. His value was in his submission, his virtue in his silence. In one report from 1691, a governor mentions that his young page boy sleeps always in the antechamber, ready to receive instruction at any hour. In another, a commander praises his clever Tamil boy, gifted to him by a village headman as a gesture of trust. The boy is described as obedient, intelligent, and quick to learn the customs of cleanliness. The report makes no mention of education, only of hygiene. These documents are not admissions. They are endorsements. To the Dutch, the system worked. To the boys, it was inescapable. The Dutch called their rule Pax Neerlandica, the Dutch peace. They built canals, codified law, standardized weights and measures. But beneath this polished veneer of bureaucracy was a system that ran not only on commerce, but on the unrecorded suffering of children. This was not incidental. It was foundational. The boys became the hands that poured wine, the mouths that learned foreign prayers, the bodies that absorbed frustration. And because the Dutch believed they were bringing order to a land of chaos, they believed the price was justified. A broken boy was a small price for a civilized colony. And the worst part, no one called it abuse. Because abuse requires recognition, and no one recognized these boys at all. His name was Arasan before they changed it. He does not remember the moment it was taken. It happened between the heat and the silence. One morning he was Arasan, the son of a toddy tapper, running barefoot along a stream with dragonflies in his fingers. That evening, he was Hendrik, a name stitched into a linen collar, and spoken in a voice that did not ask but told. Hendrik was 10. He lived in the residence of a Dutch bookkeeper in Gal, a man whose wife had died the year before of a wasting fever. The household was large. Boutkier. 2 other servants, adult men, handled the cooking and horses. Hendrik's job was different. He was to polish the brass mirror frames, light candles, press the bedsheets, and refill the Dutchman's pipe with fine-cut tobacco. But the job expanded. He was told to sit silently during evening reading, to remain in the corner, as the Dutchman recited psalms in a voice that never stumbled. Hendrik did not understand the words, but he learned the rhythm. When the readings ended, he would be summoned to stand behind the man's chair, to comb his hair, to listen without reply. One night, the man stood and beckoned. Hendrik followed. That was the beginning. There were no bruises, nothing to report, just hands that lingered too long, instructions whispered too softly, and the unbearable weight of pretending not to notice. He wanted to scream, but screaming was for children, and Hendrik had been made into something else. Across the island, in the Highland outpost of Kandy, there was another boy slightly older, perhaps 13. His name had once been Sumeda. In the household of the Dutch military commandant, he was known simply as the Brown Page. He dressed in pale blue silk, a livery imported from Batavia, tailored to make him look like a miniature officer. His job was to open the commandant's door at exactly 6 in the morning, to place slippers on the floor, and to fetch coffee without delay. He was never permitted to speak first. He was always the last to eat. Sumeda had once been quick with stories. Now, he measured every word. He had learned that silence was survival, that asking questions was punished, and that crying was not weakness, but waste. Crying changed nothing. There were moments when he almost forgot himself, when he looked into the brass kettle and saw his own reflection, pale and delicate and sharp-eyed, and wondered whether the person he used to be was still alive in there, whether the boy who had once chased monsoon beetles in the rice paddies still breathed behind the glassy stare. But then the door would open, and the commandant's voice would call his name, and he would become the page once again. At the Dutch Reformed Church in Colombo, the ministers kept careful records of conversions. Each time a servant boy was baptized, his name and age were noted, and a brief comment added, obedient, docile, mild in nature. These were not virtues. These were survival tactics. Some boys were instructed in reading, enough to recite scripture or translate orders. Others were kept deliberately illiterate. They were told that education was dangerous, that books would make them unruly, that boys who read too much lost their usefulness, and usefulness was all that mattered. In the upper floors of colonial houses, where the sunlight struck the blinds in narrow golden slats, boys like Hendrik and Sumida moved quietly through rooms, heavy with cigar smoke and damp linen. They learned how to carry perfume bottles without clinking them, how to walk without being heard, how to breathe without being noticed. There were no cries for help, no runaway posters, no legal petitions, because the system left them nowhere to run. The local courts did not recognize their testimonies. The Dutch Civil Code, applied unevenly to native subjects, offered no protection for boys in service. There were no words in the records for molestation, no phrases for psychological harm. They were not beaten in public. They were not branded. They were simply erased, day by day, until nothing remained but the role they were forced to perform. There is one letter from a Dutch pastor in 1748 that speaks, obliquely, of certain immoral attachments between officials and their houseboys. The tone is not outraged, only regretful. He writes, "It would be preferable if such affections were directed toward godly marriage. Butalosh. Nature is stubborn in foreign climates. Nature," he says, "not cruelty, not coercion, not exploitation." The pastor never names the boys. They remain shadows, unnamed, unwept, even in death. Most were not remembered. They were not buried with family, but in anonymous rows near VOC outposts. Their graves, when marked at all, bore Dutch names carved into cheap stone. No offerings, no chance, no return. They were not lost. They were taken, and they were expected to be grateful. To understand how such a practice endured, one must understand what the Dutch East India Company considered acceptable. The VOC was not a kingdom. It was a company. Its charter, granted in 1602, gave it power to wage war, sign treaties, mint currency, and rule over subjects. But above all, it existed to generate profit. In Ceylon, the profit was cinnamon, and profit required labor. Labor required control. The VOC kept meticulous ledgers. Cinnamon quotas were set for each district. Villages were taxed not in coin, but in bark and manpower. Governors were evaluated by tonnage, not compassion. Efficiency was the highest virtue. Compassion was a distraction. But there were gaps in this machine, gaps that could not be filled by soldiers or overseers. These were the spaces inside Dutch homes, courtrooms, and private offices. Spaces where local servants were essential not only for daily function, but for the illusion of civilization. And so the company encouraged quietly, informally, but pervasively the acquisition of servant boys. The Dutch called it huisdienst, house service. On paper, it appeared harmless. A native boy would be placed in a European household, clothed, fed, and perhaps taught basic Dutch. His presence was framed as both utilitarian and charitable, a civilizing opportunity, a way to uplift the native child from ignorance into order. But there was no curriculum, no path to advancement, no oversight. These boys were not considered apprentices. They were not students. They were property in all but name. And behind the closed doors of colonial homes, the rules of Europe dissolved. Dutch legal doctrine, based on Roman law, prohibited sodomy. It was punishable by death, but only if discovered, and only if prosecuted. In Ceylon, almost no such prosecutions occurred. The local courts were staffed by company officials. The judges dined with the governors. Witnesses were scarce, and when they existed, were not believed. Most tellingly, no boy servant ever testified, because no boy servant was ever asked. Punishment did exist, but they were almost always reserved for the boys themselves. For theft, for insolenza, for running away. In 1712, A boy named Petrus, no surname, was flogged in the courtyard of the Gal fort. His crime was disobedience of a repeated domestic instruction. No further details are given, but in the margin of the record, a note appears in the Dutch clerk's hand sent back to the household for continued service. The punishment was correction, not removal, because the household was never questioned. Only the boy. The colonial government went further. In 1733, a circular was sent to company officials encouraging the moral example of Christian homes. The document emphasized cleanliness, prayer, and appropriate native attendance. Boys were to be dressed modestly and neatly, and to be kept within close instruction. It sounded like reform. It was reinforcement. Even the church played its part. Missionaries praised households that allowed native boys to witness Sunday services. They urged baptism, renaming, and moral training, but they never inquired about sleeping arrangements. They never asked why some boys bore the same scars in the same places. They never challenged the system, because they were part of it. The system was not hidden. It was accepted. It was a transaction. Families gave boys. The company gave grain. Officials gave shelter. The boys gave everything else. And still, the illusion persisted that these boys were lucky, that they were safer inside white walls than outside in the jungle, that the loss of language, name, body, and will was preferable to poverty. This delusion was repeated in reports, sermons, and letters. Even in the rare instances when Dutch observers expressed discomfort, their concern was not for the boys' suffering, but for the potential scandal it might cause. They feared embarrassment, not injustice. And so the system held. In Dutch inventories, boys were listed under miscellaneous household property. Not always, but often, alongside chairs, kettles, and Portuguese rifles. They were not chained. They did not need to be. They were trapped by paper and by the normalization of silence. In a society where every official was complicit and every home a sealed chamber of discipline, there was no space for dissent. Company doctrine stated that native subjects owed loyalty to their patrons, and boys were the smallest subjects, the most loyal, the most used. The first boy did not speak. The second one did not know how. By the third, there was no longer any need to explain what was expected. The routine had become self-sustaining, generational, a script performed in silence. When one boy aged out, another would take his place. This was not policy, but pattern. It began with scarcity, a poor family, a bed harvest, a Dutch official with influence. A suggestion passed quietly through the headman that a son could bring favor, could be trained, could earn a future, and so the first boy was given. At first, the village whispered, but when no punishment followed, when the Dutch family sent back rice, or did not collect the next tax, the whispers stopped. And the next time, the family offered a second son. This time, the silence was louder. The Dutch system did not need to advertise. It simply allowed the practice to function and watched as native intermediaries replicated it. Village headmen began to keep informal lists of suitable boys, those of lighter skin, finer features, softer voix. In Candian territory, captured boys from raids were exchanged with colonial garrisons not as prisoners, but as tokens. In Jaffna, Tamil-speaking traders quietly donated children to company men in return for shipping licenses. Over time, the giving of a boy became a gesture of diplomacy, a signal of loyalty, a tradition. In some districts, it became expected. A new Dutch commander arrives. A boy is waiting. No one explains why. No one has to. Even within the Dutch ranks, the cycle hardened. Officials who had once been young VOC clerks with servant boys of their own rose through the ranks and continued the practice as governors. What had begun as indulgence became inheritance. There is a letter from 1752, written by a retiring Dutch officer to his replacement. In it, he gives advice on the household when to harvest the garden, which rooms are cooler in summer, and a final note. The boy called Simon is clever and understands his role well. Keep him close. Do not let the others interfere. No clarification. None needed. Simon was not a servant. He was part of the house. The company, in its obsession with efficiency, inadvertently preserved the cycle by reducing every personal interaction into a category: loyal, unfit, transferable. The boys became numbers, rotated through postings like furniture, and like furniture, they bore wear. Some were sent from one household to another, each time renamed, refitted, and told to forget what came before. A boy who cried too much might be traded for another. A boy who grew too tall was reassigned to stables. A boy who learned too quickly might be sent to Batavia, where the system was older, harder, and even less forgiving. Nothing was written down, but everyone knew. This was the company's genius: cruelty through omission. Even when boys tried to escape, the cycle caught them. In 1778, a boy of 13 named Titus fled from a Dutch residence near Matara. He was found 2 days later hiding in a fishing village. When brought before the magistrate, he said nothing. The official record notes, "Boy returned to household, punished accordingly, now shows satisfactory demeanor." But there is another note, a receipt for compensation, paid in grain to the villagers who returned him. He had become bounty, and once returned, he did not run again. There were no reforms. Occasionally, a new governor would speak of morality. There would be murmurs of review, of revisiting native customs, of enforcing company ethics. But always, the effort stalled. The system was too old, too quiet, too profitable, and over time, the boys themselves became teachers. The ones who survived, the ones who adapted, were sometimes promoted. A boy who had spent years learning Dutch, who knew how to polish brass and wait without being seen, might be put in charge of younger servants. He would repeat the rules, enforce the posture, ensure the silence, not because he believed, but because it was the only power left to him. In this way, the cycle infected itself. Victims became enforcers, children became tools, and so the system did not collapse. It multiplied. By the late 1700 seconds, Dutch Ceylon was a colony filled with boys who had no names of their own. They bore the surnames of their masters, spoke a broken Dutch they could not write, and flinched when doors opened behind them. When the British arrived in 1796 and seized the island, they dismantled Dutch authority, but they kept the houses, they kept the ledgers, they kept the servants, they inherited the silence, and the cycle continued. They left no diaries, no letters, no gravestones carved with their real names. The boys of Dutch Ceylon disappeared into the colonial silence. And when the Dutch were forced out by the British in 1796, the new rulers swept through the island with declarations of reform, of law, of modern order. But they did not ask where the boys had gone. They did not ask why so many houses had small rooms with no windows, or why servant quarters were built so close to the master's bedchamber. The British inherited the system, if not its memory. They dismantled the VOC, but not the idea that boys could serve, that brown skin could be bent toward white civility, that silence could be purchased with rice, or the illusion of protection. So the cycle continued, in new accents and new uniforms. But the trauma did not vanish. It calcified. In Sri Lanka's coastal towns, there are still Dutch surnames spoken by families who cannot trace a European ancestor, names passed down, not through pride, but necessity. The legacy of boys renamed by masters, whose stolen identities became lineages built on absence. In the Tamil-speaking north, oral histories whisper of boys who vanished, whose families were told they had become scholars in the capital, only for no letters to ever arrive. In Buddhist enclaves, ghost stories persist of children who wander the garden paths of old colonial homes, knocking on doors that no longer open. These are not just folk tales. They are grief, fossilized into silence. The archives of the Dutch East India Company survive tens of thousands of pages in orderly script. They detail every shipment of cinnamon, every punishment of theft, every marriage license and tax agreement. But the boys exist only in fragments. One name here, misspelled, one punishment there, unexplained, one baptism, then no mention again. The colonial record did not forget them. It never truly saw them, because they were not people in the eyes of the system. They were evidence of order, tools of assimilation, proof that the company's civilizing mission was working, and when they broke, when they aged, or resisted, or fled, they were erased, replaced, forgotten. but their absence left scars. On the families who gave them, on the communities who learned that obedience, not justice, was the only path to survival. On the nation itself, generations grew up under the weight of that silence, under a history that taught them some lives were less valuable, that suffering was best endured quietly, that serving power was safer than questioning it. The legacy of the boy servants did not vanish with colonialism. It buried itself in the structure of caste and class, in the way some children were taught to bow lower, to speak less, to expect less. It shaped education, labor, even faith, and it lingered in the language, in the way obedience was praised, in the way resistance was punished, not as defiancy, but as ingratitude. And so, even today, the rooms remain. In the old Dutch houses of Colombo, now museums or hotels, the small servant quarters still stand. The narrow staircases, the doorless corridors, the spaces designed not for sleep, but for access. You can walk through them. You can feel how tightly silence was built into the architecture. You may even ask, who lived here? But the guides rarely know, because history was not written by the boys. It was written by those who used them. And so their story remains here, not as names in stone, but as shadows on wood, not as testimony, but as absence. The price of empire was not just bark stripped from cinnamon trees. It was childhood stripped from the living. And it was justified by profit, by piety, by the slow, brutal normalization of cruelty. But cruelty does not vanish just because no one records it. It settles, and it waits. And sometimes, when the door creaks in a quiet colonial room, when the wind brushes against the stone in the night, you might hear it. Not a voice, not a cry, just the echo of someone who was never allowed to speak,